Right. So some more references about what are the themes and what's going on in science fiction in the Anglophone model as of now. As I said, the last jet engine laugh, 2001, talks about future war, Signal Red, dystopia, Generation 14 cloning, escape, gender dystopia, the beast with 9 billion feet, genetic engineering, the butterfly effect, genetic engineering, dome child AI, aliens in Delhi, of course, aliens, the competent authority, dystopia, Toke, zombies, Alice in Deadland, zombies. So these are just some indicative texts of what is happening in the Anglophone SF today. Okay.
Just give me a second. I am going to mute her. I've been sending mails. Please keep your mics mute. Keep your Okay, Dr. Sami, now you can continue.
Yeah, thank you. See, I don't say that keep your mics mute because I think this is half the fun of an online presentation when you get to hear so many people, so it's okay. It's okay. Okay, next. Some short story collections, again, Anglophone. It Happened Tomorrow, again, something I really recommend. It's an NBT publication from 93. Lists, I think multiple Indian stories translated into English from different languages to give you an overview of what is happening in the SF scene in the 1990s. Then Kleptomania, Shockwave, The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet, and other stories. Again, this is for those of you who might be interested in gender and science fiction. I would recommend three names: Vandana Singh, Manjula Padmanabhan, and Priya Sarukai Chhabria. Because they directly deal with these questions. And of course, you have Urvashi coming on later today. So you can also, you should also ask her about these questions because she has worked, specifically on these texts, right? Then Breaking the Bow, the Golan's Book of South Asian Science Fiction. This is again something I highly recommend. It's a collection of writers from South Asia who talk about science fiction in a very recent volume edited by Tarun Saint. And then you have Analog Virtual by Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan, Strange World, Strange Times, Vinayak Verma, Once Upon a Blue Moon, Sukanya Datta. Sukanya Datta is interesting because she's also a scientist, right? She's a serving scientist at CSIR and she's writing science fiction, right? So her science fiction is slightly more scientific than what you expect from other writers who are not scientists, So she, continues in the Jayant Narlikar tradition of using science fiction not just to popularize science, because in a lot of cases, science fiction people think that, okay, it's about science popularization. No, science popularization is one of the ways, is one of the methods that science fiction adopts, but SFS can be about other things too. In fact, most of SF and Anglophone SF today is about reorienting the way we perceive external reality. And SF, as was being discussed earlier, SF is not just predictive. SF doesn't just predict what is to come. No, that is not the purpose of science fiction. Ursula Le Guin says that the purpose of science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. As in, it is not predictive what is going to happen in the future. It is describing what is happening to us today. That may be gender violence, that may be fundamentalism, that may be fanaticism, that may be patriarchy, that may be terrorism, that may be acute inequality between the rich and the poor, that may be acute inequality between person A and person B in the same geographical space. So science fiction is describing, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. Science fiction describes, critiques, interrogates, investigates these fundamental disruptions in our reality, right? So science fiction is one of those genres. I mean, of course, and once you read these books or once you engage, you will find out what I'm talking about. There's also this film, I think it was based on Manjula Padmanabhan's novel called Deham, right? Deham, Deham. It was not a commercial success, but it was a science fiction film, and I suggest you watch it. 2004 or 5, if I'm not mistaken, around that time. Right. But then, now that you have access to a lot of these texts, I've taken you through these texts. I've, from short story collections to novels to films to web series, across different languages from, say, English to Hindi to Marathi to Tamil to Bangla to Telugu, right? How do you approach Indian science fiction? And this is where I realized that. So when I was doing my PhD and when I was I was always interested in science fiction. I realized that there were no frameworks to explicate homegrown science fiction, Indian science fiction, right? And we were coming from this assumption, many of us, that okay, the West creates theory, and India or the global South is the data, right? So we were the data, but the theory was coming to us from someplace else. It was I wouldn't say it was being imposed on us, but we were sort of, under the hegemony of such theoretical structures that said, okay, well, this is coming from that place, this is coming from Harvard, therefore it must be good, and therefore it must be fully applicable on us every time. And that's not really, a very fruitful way to approach, though that is one way to approach things. But so this is a question I ask myself a lot about now that we have data, how to approach Indian science fiction. How to explicate it, how to understand it, how to write it, how to teach it, how to research it. And I felt the need for a model that somehow explicated and engaged with Indian science fiction, a theory, a model, a method, whatever, way you would like to use this particular thing. And that is how the in situ model was born. So very, very quickly, though, of course, I talk about the space, that is speciality, time, temporality, and being, that is identity of Indian science fiction. My particular data to me was coming from India's contemporary Anglophone science fiction. So that is where my data was coming from. And on the basis of that, I created this. And this was comprised, and this constituted, three theses. The transmit thesis, which came to us in the form of Star Warriors of the Modern Raj, the entire monograph. The Antekal thesis, which is coming to us in the Rutledge Handbook of Alternate Co-Futurisms. Not alternate, but the Rutledge Handbook of Co-Futures. And the Neo-Monsters model, which is coming to us through a paper in the Journal of Popular Culture and Foundation in the next few months. And what these are, very quickly. So I argue that Indian SF could be explicated by these three theses, right? The transmit thesis talks about how technology, ideology, and mythology intersect, integrate, and interrogate specific SF texts, right? So many SF texts that you take, in fact, most SF texts that you take from India would somehow be playing with these three vertices of a triangle. They would be playing with newer technologies. They would be playing with emergent, ideologies, and they would be playing with sedimented mythologies. And this sort of tension, this trialectic between these three, is evident in almost all the SF texts that we engage. Almost, not all, clearly, because you will always have exceptions. So this was about the genre space of Indian SF in India within a larger global subset and the overall vertices through which we could approach SF texts. This was the first thesis. The second thesis was about time. And I was like, okay, now that I know that how space works in Indian science fiction and how Indian science fiction works in space, and you have these three vertices, if you have these three, think of a three-dimensional model, think of a, three axes, X, Y, and Z. So you have technology, ideology, and mythology as the three axes, X, Y, Z, and then you have texts which appear at different locations in the, in this three-dimensional coordinate diagram, three-dimensional coordinates, depending on how they quantify and approach technology, ideology, and mythology. Right. The second question that I wanted to ask myself was that how does time operate? So I know how space operates. How does time operate in Antekal? And for that, I came up with the idea of Antekal, right? Now, Antekal talks about the temporality of Indian science fiction. And this is a word that I consciously, fuse four different concepts of temporalities and time, which Indian science fiction or SF in general manifests. What are these four conceptions? Antekal word itself, it sort of takes from the Latin and Greek ante and anti, right? So before and against. Kal, of course, from our own conception of Kal, time. So the first two is before time, against time, right? And then, of course, you have Ant E Kal, that is slightly Persianized, the end of time. And of course, then the fourth one, Anant Kal, that is eternal time. So the way these four temporalities intersect and operate in science fiction or speculative fiction, you can, of course, apply it to other kinds of modalities too. But I thought it primarily and specifically for SF of the Global South about how temporalities operate and how you have objects, phenomena, texts, themes, narratives that are against time, against what we consider is the linear flow of time, B, before time. So we think that, okay, this thing happens in 1857, and then the text says, no, it happens in, 1747. So you have against time. You have end of time, as in you move beyond the entire idea of time itself. And then Anant time, which is like Anant Kal, which is eternal time. So then this particular narrative is based on a particular idea of time being eternal, right? And how these four kind of temporalities engage with Indian SF or literature in general. The third, okay, first of all, I should stop here and ask, is this okay? Can I move on? Can I move on? Yes or no?
Yes, you can proceed, sir.
Okay, thank you. So then I came to my third question. Now, this was again extremely important. It was about the being, about who is being portrayed in Indian science fiction. Who's the center? Who's the periphery? Who's the margin? Who's the core? What is normative? And then I came up with the idea of the neo-monsters, right, which is my current project, which is my current postdoc project that I'm running here at Oslo. So neo-monsters, I see monsters as an acronym, right, for mutating and mutagenic ontological narratives in space-time echoing realistic situations, right? So monsters. So I don't see mutants, clones, monsters, AI robots, zombies, aliens, etc. as not just aliens, zombies, etc. No, but as neo-monsters, as in they are mutating and mutagenic ontological narratives in space-time that echo realistic situations, which means that SF is not just predictive, it is descriptive. Who are the others of science fiction? Who are the people who are being marginalized? Who are the people who are facing the brunt of an unequal system? And then I see you have zombies and aliens and clones and mutants. And then why is it that these otherized, these marginalized people are treated the way they are treated? And the neo-monsters thesis explicates this otherization, marginality, alterity, in fact, what I call the alters of alterity of science fiction, right? So for me, this is a model with which I work. This is the model that I evolved. Again, this is a working model. This may have been published, this may have been out there, but as always, no model, no theory is perfect. This is a working model through which I try to make sense of Indian science fiction. If you think it works for you, go ahead. If you think it doesn't work for you, no problem, right? But as always, this model has scope for improvement. But this is something that I work with, and that is what I want to share with you, because we are not just talking about texts, theories. We are not just talking about themes. We're also talking about how to make sense of the data that is available to us. And this is one way of making sense of the data that is available to us, primarily because when I was creating this model in 2018 or 19, there were no models available for Indian SF which talked about similar phenomena. So we had to come up with something that made sense of what we were reading or viewing, right? And this is taken from Star Warriors, as I said, which talks about the transmit thesis categorically, which is a critical catalog of post-2000 narratives. It evolves a transmit thesis to investigate how mythology, ideology, and technology contour Indian science fiction. This approach identifies the modes of marginalization, studies the manifestations of divine beings as hybridized epistemological categories, and locates the deployment of newer technologies in order to link India's science fiction with its changing being and times. Okay. So this was about transmit. Then something about neo monsters. So to give you a very quick example of what neo monsters does, right? So when I was studying zombies in India, I again felt the utter lack of a model through which we can approach our own literature, our own cultural production, right? And that is why the Neo Monsters thesis came into being, and that is how the Neo Monsters epidemiology for zombies came into being. Because this particular epidemiology identifies etiology, that is the birth cause of the zombie, the mode of transmission of the infected, the treatment cure of the infected, and the epicenter and ideology of the outbreak. And through this, I was able to investigate about what zombies are, what they do, how are they different from zombies in the West, what is the intention behind these zombies, all these questions that we have about texts that we read, right? Right? So Goa Gone, what is, to give you one example, Goa Gone, what is the etiology of the zombie? It's a Russian drug called D2RF from near the Siberian border that once consumed turns people into zombies. Transmission of the infected is the typical bite scratch method we see in Western science fiction. The treatment cure of the infected, well, there is no treatment or cure. However, the zombies get slowed down when they are showered with cocaine, which is another drug, right? So this is a countercultural drug usage and also hinting at what drugs can do. And then the epicenter and ideology of the outbreak is primarily, well, the epicenter is, of course, this island in Goa in the middle of a rave. But the ideology is consumerism. And the idea and how this entire idea of purchasing power leading to consumerism can actually make a society implode from within. So this is a very rough, example of what the Neo Monsters thesis attempts to do with zombies. With aliens, I'm working on a different methodology that would be out soon, right? So because every monster, while there are unifying links, every monster needs a new kind of explicatory lens. Right. And then there's stuff about writing SF, and this is something I would like to leave you guys with, that we live at the cusp of doom, horror, fantasy, folklore, mythology, science fiction speaks to us. Just try thinking about, once this presentation is done, once this workshop is done, in case you have time over this weekend, just sit with a cup of tea somewhere and just think about what can be an issue worth writing for and in our mushroom clouded age, how to reinterpret and adapt your ideas across different mediums, how does it hybridize with other speculative traditions, how does it disrupt and support genre conventions, and the sources that you can use can be indigenous or external. It can be India's own linguistic and cultural traditions, India's Anglophone networks, a globalized cultural production. You can borrow from local folklore, national myths, universal science. You can adhere to genre conventions, yet expand boundaries of the genre. This is something I love to do. Take something which is an established genre, and then you destabilize it just a little bit. And you realize that the entire system sort of, I won't say fall apart, but you can play with the entire narrative scheme, and that is the fun of writing, right? You can ask yourself what shapes your project. Who are you writing for? Are you writing for the market? Are you writing for aesthetics? Are you writing for some political gains? Well, whatever. I personally write just for fun. I do not write for the market. If I did write for the market, I wouldn't be writing SF in India at a time when SF in India didn't really sell. In fact, most of my publishers told me that, why are you writing science fiction? Write romance or mythology, it sells. And I told them, no, I'm not in the business of selling. I'm in the business of having fun when I'm writing. If you want to publish it, go ahead. If not, fine. Right? But you can, of course, choose your poison about how you want to do things, right? You can ask yourself about what form does it adopt and adapt, but it should challenge its own being. So basically just have fun, right? With your own idea of writing, with your own ideas. And then nothing, the sky is the limit. Zombies, aliens, AIs, robots, CBR and warfare, cloning, nanotech, environmental degradation, Rakshas, Bhoot, Pishach, death, fantasy, dragons, whatever works for you. Whatever works for you, go for it. And just one last thing before we end this and we move on to the Q&A is that, again, a request. After this is done and when you guys have time, maybe next week or whenever, just sit and ask yourself about what's something that really bothers you today in our world today. And if you were to fix it, if you're a scientist, if you can somehow create a technology to fix that particular problem, what would be that problem and what would be that technology? And once you have that, maybe then you can think about the impact of that, of that technology, and we can think some more. So with this, thank you so much for this. We can have a conversation now.
Before I formally thank Dr. Sami, I want to invite all the participants to raise their questions